I want that.
So I'm going to print these three as a series on my Rushford report.
Great.
Because in the idea.
Joining us this morning, this is Greg Rushford. This is the second of 3 parts in a series of lectures by him. Mr. Rushford will be talking about international trade and is the editor and publisher of the Rushford Report. So thank you, Mr. Rushford, for joining us again this morning. And we'll let you get started.
Okay, welcome to the second of these 3 classes. I am Greg Rushford. This is the same basic presentation on political economy that I've made over the years to college economics classrooms. But if it sounds rather daunting to present college level material to high school students, it shouldn't be. Basic concepts are not difficult. Anyone can get this simply by beginning to look around what's in their daily lives and then grasping a few simple economic definitions. For sure, looking around us here in Rappahannock County, Virginia, doesn't immediately suggest that global trade flows touch our lives at all. We're in the boonies, tucked away in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. We're only 70 miles west of downtown Washington, D.C., but we're in the middle of nowhere. Our county, Rappahannock, is about the same size as Singapore, but instead of nearly 6 million people, there are only 7,000 of us. Why we don't even have one stoplight on our quiet country roads. But look more closely. Look up to the Virginia Inland Port. It's about 20 minutes to our north, just outside the little town of Front Royal. You'd be surprised at the amount of international cargo that goes through customs at the Front Royal Inland Port. It handles twice the cargo traffic as do the major U.S. southern seaports of Miami and Jacksonville combined. Many of the goods come into Front Royal's customs zone from nearby Dulles International Airport, perhaps an hour's drive from the east out Interstate Highway I-66. The imports also come up to Front Royal from Norfolk, Virginia, the big mid-Atlantic U.S. seaport some 220 miles to our southeast. They come by rail and interstate highways, and then they are sent from Front Royal onto other major cities whose economies also depend upon international trade. Atlanta to the south, Chicago to the west, and so on. And of course, the same international products are right here in Rappahannock County. My wife and I often look around our American-made home and marvel at how the international marketplace is at our front door, literally. That door comes from mahogany that was harvested in Honduras, finished in Costa Rica. We've got cherry wood floors that come from Brazil. We have lights made in China. There's a granite countertop from India. Some fixtures in our bathrooms come from Italy, and much more. So if trade is obviously so important to our lives, why do so many Americans believe it is, quote, unfair? The heart of the matter begins to be seen in just 2 economic definitions that are in Econ 101 college textbooks. The first is price discrimination. Price discrimination. The second, international price discrimination. The terms are presented in the textbooks in a rather dry fashion, but they're not dry at all to those who understand the politics that fuel the antagonisms towards trade. Price discrimination is pretty simple. It involves products that are sold at lower prices in some markets than others. Widgets might be sold at cheaper prices in, say, South Dakota than in Manhattan, based on calculations that New Yorkers might pay more. Or they might even be sold below their cost of production, at a loss. You've perhaps noticed the so-called loss leaders in your supermarkets. These are items priced so cheaply that they entice shoppers into the stores. It's often called cutthroat pricing. Economists tend to praise such ruthless pricing wars as they encourage healthy competition. Only if price discrimination becomes predatory, That's a key word. Predatory is a legal antitrust term. Then, if it's predatory, economists frown. Predation happens when, say, a large corporation with deep financial reserves deliberately prices products so low as to drive the little competitors out of business. Then the big guys are left with so-called market power or monopoly power, so they can raise prices on helpless consumers who don't have a choice. The antitrust laws are meant to police such uncompetitive economic behavior. An automobile could be made in Detroit and then sold more cheaply to Americans who live in Alabama, for example. That's fine. But what if the Canadians make automobiles and export them to Americans at prices that are lower than in Canada? Now we're talking international price discrimination. International price discrimination is the same as domestic price discrimination, except here the goods cross international borders and are considered as having been dumped. They're considered as having been politically, quote, unfair. People scream when they can't compete with the foreign competition. Such unfairly dumped goods can be taxed with high tariffs. Here in the United States, this happens a lot. Domestic concerns that can't match the prices of their foreign competitors find themselves good lawyers. These lawyers then file anti-dumping lawsuits with the US government, which investigates and decides whether to tax the unfair imports with tariffs. These dumping cases are considered by the US Commerce Department and an independent agency called the International Trade Commission, each of which has bureaucracies to consider anti-dumping complaints by looking at the costs of production. We don't need to go into those bureaucracies here, but you should be aware at least that they exist. The domestic advocates of anti-dumping laws frame their arguments using antitrust-like language of predatory pricing. Politicians often misleadingly call international price discrimination illegal dumping. In fact, it's not illegal at all to price automobiles at lower prices in some countries than the home market. The international price discrimination, again, is just subject to being taxed. The rationale is more political than economic. Here's how this works. Now we're getting to the fun stuff, the fights over money and jobs that fuel all of this. I first began to understand the world of anti-dumping litigation almost exactly 36 years ago this week, around Mother's Day 1984. American flower growers were upset that Colombia was exporting roses to US markets at low prices, prices that rose growers in Michigan, say, couldn't match. That was unfair, the American Rose Lobby complained. So the rose growers hired lawyers to petition the federal government to put high tariffs on the import competition from Colombia. Now, tariffs, of course, are taxes imposed on American businesses that import foreign products. American consumers who buy the foreign goods are taxed again when the importers pass along their extra costs in the form of higher prices. The American rose growers hoped that the higher tariffs on Colombian roses would allow them to keep prices high. I took the roses story to the CBS Evening News in May of 1984. The rose you buy for Mother's Day is part of an international trade war. That was when I realized that economics could easily be explained to normal Americans who have never heard of price discrimination. The economic principle in the Colombia flowers dumping case was what the famous economic theorist David Ricardo, you'll hear his name in your first college economics course, what David Ricardo called comparative advantage. Rough translation, countries export products that they are better at making than their trading partners. They import products that others make better. This isn't rocket science. In the roses case, the Colombians' comparative advantage was sunshine, tropical sunshine that nourished rose beds for free. By contrast, The rose growers in places like Michigan had to pay the higher costs of electricity necessary to heat greenhouses in cold weather. The American rose growers thought that was unfair, and they wanted the rest of us to pay higher prices to keep them in business. The American petitioners lost the rose dumping case in 1984. It's easy to argue that that was a sensible economic outcome. Just go in your local grocery store, see those wonderful flowers from Central America offered at affordable prices. And trade, of course, is a two-way street. Colombians buy American machinery, cereals, various electrical and electronic goods, and much more. Fast forward from the 1980s, and today there are hundreds of these dumping cases where American industries have successfully sought high tariffs on too many products to mention here. Many of them involve various types of steel, pipes, tubes, wire, hot rolled steel, cold rolled steel, and so on. There have been anti-dumping fights over bicycles, pencils, nails, bedroom furniture, candles, softwood lumber, manhole covers, and even something called extruded rubber thread. Extruded rubber thread is the rubber-like stuff that puts the snap in your underwear. It's part of an international trade conflict. Now, seafood products from crawfish, catfish, salmon, and shrimp have, have their own anti-dumping politics. American catfish farmers from states like Mississippi and Arkansas were upset that they couldn't compete with catfish from Vietnam. So upset that they persuaded the US Congress to make it illegal to call catfish from Vietnam catfish. When you go into the seafood section of your supermarket, check out swai or basa or tra. These are ways to say catfish in Vietnamese. The idea was to make the affordable foreign catfish look perhaps too scary to eat. That didn't work, though. Basa sounded well exotic and interesting to American consumers. Then the word was spread foreign catfish was unhealthy. When nobody got sick, the American catfish turned to lawyers who persuaded the US government to hit the foreign fish with anti-dumping tariffs. Then the Vietnamese exports to America slowed down for a while, but the Chinese saw an opening and started to sell us their catfish. Economists have a name for this. It's called trade diversion. Or take shrimp. Americans who catch wild shrimp off the coastlines from the mid-Atlantic that stretch down from the Carolinas around Florida onto Louisiana and Texas along the Gulf of Mexico. All the Americans who catch these wild shrimp can't catch enough to supply even one national US grocery chain like Costco. There isn't enough American wild-caught shrimp to supply Red Lobster restaurants nationwide. Not one nationwide restaurant chain. So it takes foreign shrimp, most of it's grown on farms in 20-some countries around the world, to supply the shrimp you buy in your grocery stores. When I was young, living in a small town in Illinois, the first time I ever got shrimp was when our family took a vacation to Florida. Today, consumers in that small town in Illinois and all over the country, thanks to international freight services, bring in fresh imported seafood to Americans every day. So that's what trade looks like when free markets work properly. It creates winners. But so far, I've only told you one side of the story. There's another. International trade also creates losers. Never forget this. We are talking about people with real lives here, people who lose their jobs through no fault of themselves, but because they had worked in industries that no longer were globally competitive. We could talk all day about this. Tell a steel worker from Ohio or Pennsylvania whose mill is shut down to praise economic efficiency and just move on with his life. Tell those steel workers whose factories moved to Mexico to appreciate economic efficiencies. Tell women who have worked for generations in textile mills in the Carolinas that they should go to community college or enter various training programs where they should learn to do something else. Tell catfish farmers in the Mississippi Delta that they should just accept the fact that their competitors in the Mekong Delta and Southeast Asia can offer the same fish to Americans at lower prices. You won't get far. Change may be necessary, but it is often wrenching. So the anti-dumping laws may not be regarded highly by economists, but they have a very important political rationale, a safety valve to help these people who are displaced move on. The losses from global competition can shake entire communities. I've been in declining steel towns in Pennsylvania to see stand up for steel rallies. Angry people came from miles around, the unemployed workers, their families, high school bands, mayors, and even preachers who railed against foreign steel. But then again, even this story isn't so simple. I remember one CEO of the local steel mill stirring the crowd by shouting that the foreigners could take their steel and shove it. But when I later went to his office, it turns out the same CEO had also been busy doing profitable business with his Korean steelmaking partner. So in political economy, when people fight over money and jobs, things are often quite not so simple as they appear. What we're talking about today is a political economic problem that nobody has ever been able to answer satisfactorily. In the 19th century, you may have heard of the Luddites. They were workers who tried to prevent new machinery being brought into their mills that would throw some of the workers out in the streets. The blacksmiths were trapped when automobiles began to replace horses. Whenever there's rapid progress in technology and science that demands change, the lives of decent people will be upended. Not everyone will be able to cope without help. So that's what we're talking about here. Next week, in class 3, I want to tell you how these fights over money and jobs are handled in the World Trade Organization. That's the international institution based in Geneva, Switzerland, that governs the rules of international trade flows. The World Trade Organization and its predecessor institution, something called the General Agreement on Tariffs on Trade, they've been working for the last 70 years. There are big issues here. They've spanned my entire life. They're now beginning to change, and I'll explain why next week and why that's important. Hopefully, these classes in political economy will help you think through these issues for yourselves. And that's basically it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mr. Rushford. So we have some time this morning for any questions you all might have. I know this is a lot of information, but if you have any questions on anything that Mr. Rushford spoke about this morning or anything else relating to economics or even the local trade facility there in Front Royal, go ahead, and this is our opportunity to ask the question.
Well, there is a lot of material there. If you've never heard this before, it might come at you all at once. You'll have your whole lives to think it through.
Yeah, sometimes I think this sort of thing becomes more relevant as you're seeing something play out in real time, and then your mind goes back to the lessons that you're sharing with us today.
Mr. Lumford, I have a question.
Great.
Can you hear me?
I could hear you say, "Can you hear me?" And then I see a nice picture, but that's it.
Okay. I was wondering if you could explain to us a little more about the current situation that's going on with the China trade war. I was hearing a little bit about it on the news just this morning. And, you know, you hear things on both sides. You know, we're making progress on that, or how it's going to hurt us. And I just wanted to see what your take was on it and what information you could kind of add to that.
Well, that's a big question to answer in a few minutes. China, under the communist government that took over in 1949, became one of the poorest countries in the world. There are over 1 billion people there. In 1978, they started to open up and they realized that they needed to trade to prosper. Uh, and China's a huge country, but they started to buy uh, some of their bauxite and aluminum and steel products from Australia instead of remote regions in China. By bringing in the imports and learning to trade, China started to develop markets, and hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens, as you know, are living better lives today because of the trade. China's become the second largest economy in the world. Um, when you buy, say, sneakers made by Adidas or Nike, they may be labeled made in China, but the real labor is probably 15% of that cost of your shoes, the labor, the low price stuff. The big money is made in the United States here. The people who think it up, design, advertise, market, and so forth. So on that level, trade with China is beneficial for everybody. Problem is that the Chinese have uh, not been much of a leader in international trade. If the general secretary of the Communist Party were an enlightened liberal internationalist, we would have known that by now, and he isn't. They've been stealing our intellectual property, our companies' trade secrets, and doing a lot of things that aren't necessarily about trade, but they're underhanded and they're undermining us, and it's a big problem. They have state-owned enterprises, government corporations, that require Communist Party officials to sit on the boards and watch over things. Um, that's not healthy competition. Uh, as to what to do about it in the current tariff wars, this is, nobody has the answer that they can just spot out easily unless you go on cable television. I would say this, that the high tariff wars that the United States started have already started to slow down global economic growth. They had started to slow down the growth by the end of last year before the coronavirus came along. Uh, so if people tell you that tariffs are the answer, you might put your hand in your wallets.
Great. Thanks for asking that. That was a great question, Trish. Anybody else have any questions this morning for Mr. Rushford?
Greg, this is Paul. I have a quick question for you for the benefit of the class. You know, two of the big acronyms you hear about in international trade are the World Trade Organization, WTO, and then the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Can you provide us with a thumbnail description of what each of those two does?
Well, I can do better than that. That's the subject of next week's class. The GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, it's the most boring term I've ever heard, the GATT. But maybe deliberately so, because it avoids some political emotions. It was set up in 1947 after World War II. One of the reasons that there was conflict and led to millions of deaths in World War II was the high tariff wars of the 1930s. So the GATT was set up to start lowering the tariffs so nations would, trade wars lead to shooting wars. That was the idea. The GATT is now called the WTO, and it's been known as the WTO, the World Trade Organization, for the last 25 years. And the headquarters are in Geneva, Switzerland. There are 164 country members, and they meet to negotiate ways to liberalize the smooth flows of trade. And so all the trading partners are created equally. Is called MFN, multinational, most favored nation status, which is a boring term, but it just means treat everybody equally and don't discriminate against your trading partners. And that the GATT and the WTO have been the world's most successful international economic experiment ever. Tariffs were maybe in the 40% tariffs. That's a high tax to pay. Instead of $100 for something, you pay 140. They've now fallen in most countries, the advanced countries, to 1 or 2%. So along with the lowering of tariffs, we've had rising global prosperity around the world for the last 70 years. That's the framework for next week's class, but then we'll get into more of the details about why that era is now under severe challenge. And I think the students in this class might want to take these notes and keep them, because the world may be changing. We'll see whether or not it's for the better, but this is big business here. This is important.
Great. Anybody else have any questions for Mr. Rushford this morning? Excellent. Well, I want to thank you again, Mr. Rushford, for your willingness to do this. This is part 2 in a 3-part series. So Mr. Rushford will be back with us next Tuesday morning at 9:45. And this morning, in about 30 minutes, Mr. Tim Nolan will be giving his talk, and coincidentally or perfectly timed, it's also on economics and specifically the principle of resource scarcity. Mr. Nolan is a former CIA intelligence officer and a UN development economist. So we will look forward to hearing from him in approximately 30 minutes. And just want to say thank you again. Thanks everybody for joining us this morning. See you in half an hour.
Thank you, Mr. Rushford.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Oh. Whoop. I see